afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the first sessions of Azure Partner Fest. Few words on myself, Francois. I'm managing a team of cloud solution architects in Microsoft. And today we will introduce the first session of Azure Partner Fest, the first of 7 sessions. We will start with Azure NetApp Files. But as you can see on the screens, it will run for more than a month, where you will discover different solutions running all on Azure and how you can leverage the best of all our partner solutions on Azure, on NetApp, to some solutions on storage, on compute, on connectivity, or even on how you deploy your workload using infrastructure as code. Before we deep dive into NetApp File, let me introduce some housekeeping rules. This session is recorded, right, and will be available on demand. Please submit your question at any point of time using this small Q&A panel on site, right? We will answer them right away, but we will also keep 10 minutes at the end of the sessions to have more interaction with our speakers today. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce 2 speakers for today. Ricky from Azure NetApp Files and Murthy from Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. Okay, once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your region and the time zone where you join from. My name is Murthy Annadurai, and I'm a Cloud Solution Architect here at Microsoft. First of all, thank you all for joining us today. So without any further ado, let's just directly jump into the session. So most of you guys might already know that Microsoft has a robust, partner ecosystem, and also has heavily invested, in very broad and very comprehensive set of cloud platform and various services, right? So what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to empower the customers and to ensure that our customers stay at the forefront of their cloud transformation. So especially if you look at when it comes to the high performing system, in the case of high performing system or any sort of applications, the cloud adoption poses many challenges, because the reason is very simple, be it in terms of compute or storage or availability, etc. The reason is that high performing application requires high performing infrastructure as well. So it always goes to 1:1 kind of a ratio, right? So in today's session, we are going to look at one of the very high performing storage services in Azure, and that we offer in partnership with NetApp. It's called Azure NetApp Files, also known as ANF. And ANF is a fully managed first-party service that you can deploy and configure right from the Azure portal in a matter of minutes, if not seconds, right? So it's that simple, and that's how it's been integrated with your Azure platform. Also, I would like to emphasize here that the ANF is our true first-party service. It's not a marketplace offering. And what it means that you can purchase and get support directly from Microsoft, right? This also means there are no any separate license or any support arrangements required. So your existing contract with Microsoft is enough to cover all your support needs. So that's how we tag this as a first party service. So also the ANF appears as just another native service in your Azure portal, and as well as in your Azure billing. You won't get charged separately for ANF. So as part of your Azure billing, the ANF also is going to be just blended into as one of the service. Right. So here with me, I have my awesome colleague Ricky, and who will be sharing more about ANF offerings and how it helps your business to achieve more. Right. And during this session, if you have any questions or clarifications, as what Francois mentioned, please post them in the chat window, and this will enable us to address them during the Q&A session, which is coming in later part of the session. So without any further ado, I'll pass on to Ricky to talk more about ANF. Ricky, over to you.
Thank you, Murthy. Thank you, Francois. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricky. I'm based out of Singapore. I'm the regional specialist for Azure NetApp Files. So we're going to take you through these slides. There's 3 sections. an overview, key use cases, and a demo. So let's get right into it, right? Next slide, please. Let me orient everybody first, right? Where does it actually fit in the entire Azure storage portfolio, right? So you have, anything in Azure from disk storage, object storage, file-based storage, data transfer, and hybrid edge storage. We fall in the category of file-based storage. If you're familiar with Azure Files, you can think of Azure NetApp Files as the big brother to Azure Files. Next slide, please. And as Murthy alluded before, right? What is it, right? So let me start with the cloud storage considerations, right? So when you're trying to move your workload into the cloud, and you're thinking about storage, what do you think about, right? To make it very simple, you think about two things. Can it support my workload's requirements? Does it have all the file protocols necessary that I need? Does it have sufficient performance? And what about things like backup and DR capabilities, right? So the second point is it easy to use? I mean, you shouldn't be encumbered by, having to think about different tasks of managing your storage, et cetera. You want to make it as simple as possible and yet meeting all of your needs. So how ANF or Azure NetApp Files helps is that it is a file-based storage or an enterprise NAS in Azure, supports all the major file sharing protocols, very high performance. We also have built-in enterprise data management features. And best of all, it's a platform as a service offering. So everything's wrapped nicely. Within a few mouse clicks, you can use it, right? And we'll actually show you how easy it is to use at the end of this presentation. Like Murthy alluded to before, ANF is a collaboration between Microsoft and NetApp, but it's offered as a first-party Azure service, completely integrated into Azure. So you don't need anything in terms of a contract or license from NetApp. And if you look at the diagram on the right, basically what we do is that we actually brought our cloud, our storage operating system, it's called ONTAP, as well as our storage hardware, which is an all-flash hardware, and we bring that together with Microsoft and place it inside Azure data centers. So it gives you that really high performance with very low latency that you can expect you might actually need for your demanding workloads. Next slide, please. So let me break it down a bit more, right? So we talked about ANF. It's a first-party service. It's a platform as a service offering. It's sold and maintained and supported directly by Microsoft. So it's you can liaise with Microsoft directly, and it's delivered straight through the Azure portal. It's also available in all the tools that you would expect, like the Azure Calculator. Now, first feature is about the protocols, right? So it supports all the major protocols, including SMB2, SMB3, NFS version 3 and 4. And this might think, you might think, well, okay, that's quite common, right? But actually, you might actually run into problems where you're running a legacy protocol like NFS version 3, and you find it a bit hard to move your application into the cloud. Well, we can help you with that. We also have a very unique proposition, what's called a dual protocol volumes. Using dual protocol, you can have a single volume that actually supports both SMB and NFS. So both Linux and Windows applications can read and write to it at the same time. So say, for example, you have a case where you have a data logging tool that's collecting data using Linux, but you want to process the data using Windows. In the past, you'd have to create a separate volume for the Linux version, keep your data in there, then copy it over to an SMB version for Windows where you can actually process it. Using the dual protocol capability, you don't need to do that. You basically use the same volume, so you save space basically, and that same data can be read and written to by both Linux and Windows simultaneously. Next, please. The next one is really important. This is probably the most important part about ANF. It's about performance, performance, performance. So we provide very high performance, very high throughput with sub-millisecond latency. And that's really important. We're talking about latency under 1 millisecond sustained, right? Not in burst, not depending on the situation of usage, but sustained sub-millisecond latency. And there's 3 tiers available: ANF Standard, Premium, and Ultra. So you can actually use whichever version you need, depending on your workload. If I direct you to the top right corner, The difference in standard, premium, and ultra is basically through the throughput, right? So the numbers there are throughput per terabyte. For example, standard gets you 16 megabits per second throughput per terabyte. So if you provision 5 terabytes, for example, you will get 16 times 5 or 80 megabits per second throughput. Premium is 4 times standard, and ultra is 8 times standard. And so with all these three choices, you basically can cater to any need across your workloads. Next, please. And the last part about the main features is the availability, right? Out of the box, ANF gives you 4 nines. That's 4 nines out of the box. So you don't have to worry about setting up your HA cluster separately. You already enjoy 4.9 availability out of the box, and we take care of that in the back end. Next, please. Now, in terms of the enterprise data management features that are built in, right? One of the most interesting pieces is the nature of ANF. ANF is a dynamic storage, and what this means is that you can actually modify your volumes, be it the capacity or the performance, independently of the business application that's using it. So you can manipulate the storage with zero downtime to the application itself. And therefore, you can think of it as you're completely decoupling your application and your storage, right? So then you can just worry about your business processes and your business applications, and the storage is easily managed with zero downtime. Next, please. We also have built-in data protection. And what this means is that there's built-in capability to do backups, right? With a very storage efficient way of doing it, which I'll talk about later. And this also helps you protect you against ransomware as well. The backups are completely read-only, so they're immutable, so to speak. And you can, if you get attacked by ransomware, for example, you can restore from a last known good version. Next, please. And last but not least, Azure NetApp Files, or ANF, comes with a built-in disaster recovery solution, and we'll talk about that a bit more. It's called cross-region replication. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to deep dive a bit into those 3 enterprise data management features, right? The dynamic storage, the built-in data protection capability, and the built-in disaster recovery capability. So before I do that, I would want to first show you the kind of the hierarchy of and introduce some terminologies just for the sake of the next slides, right? So in this slide, you see that on top is your Azure subscription, and then underneath that, you have what's called an Azure NetApp account that you have to create. It's just a matter of grouping. That's just a grouping mechanism. And then below that, you have capacity pools. Capacity pools is where you set your level, right? You set the ANF level, whether it be ultra or premium or standard. And then everything under that capacity pool will inherit those properties. So once you have a capacity pool set up, you then break it up into multiple volumes as you need. And all those volumes, like I said, inherit the properties of the capacity pool. And then the volumes are actually the ones that you use for your storage. You would mount them, and then your applications would point to them, right? So just keep in mind those two, the last two terminology, right? A capacity pool that gets broken down into volumes. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is probably the first interesting piece, right? I want to show you just exactly how dynamic ANF, right? Sorry, can you go back? Can you press the back button? Okay. So let's start off with a capacity pool that has an ultra setting, right? It's a 4 terabyte size. So the SLA in terms of performance that you get is 128 megabits per second times 4. So this capacity pool has a total throughput capability of about 512 megabits per second. And let's say I created 2 volumes there, volume A, which is 2 terabytes, and volume B, which is 1 terabyte. Volume A would automatically get 2 times 128, or 256 megabits per second. And volume B would automatically get 1 times 128, or 128 megabits per second. Now let's say that you're already running this, you have a bunch of applications mounting these volumes, and you're happily running them. And then suddenly you realize, oh, I need more space in volume A. So with no downtime, you can actually just increase it with 2 or 3 clicks of a button. Can you press the next, please? Sorry, go forward. Press the next button, please. Yeah. So with a few clicks of the button, what happens is that I can actually increase the size of the volume to, let's say, 3 terabytes, right? And automatically the throughput increases as well, becomes 3 times 128. So this property that's linking the size to the throughput is interesting because then our customers use it 2 different ways. Number one is that they actually need more storage. Right? So you actually need more storage, so you increase the storage. But also, number 2 is that they needed a temporary performance boost. Just by changing the size of the volume, you automatically get a performance boost, right? So for example, customers that are running intensive jobs that only happen like a few times in the month, during those periods, you can actually get that performance boost temporarily just by increasing the volume size. Now, another example that I want to show about the dynamicity is that what if you just realize like, oh, volume B doesn't have to be in an ultra capacity pool. I want to open up some space on the first capacity pool. So I need to move volume B to another capacity pool with a lower performance grade. You can do that too. You can dynamically change service levels. Next, please. So what happens is with a few clicks of a button, you just say, hey, volume B, move to this other capacity pool. And automatically in the background, everything changes. The performance level changes, the throughput changes to become that according to the new capacity pool, which is under premium. And now you have just opened up some capacity in the ultra capacity pool that they can now use, right? And so in both these examples, you've seen that there's a relationship between size and throughput, right? The larger the size, the higher the throughput. Well, what if you want to break that? Is that a hard and fast rule? Can you actually break that? And the answer is yes. Next, please. You can actually also manually set throughput. This is called manual QoS. If you look at the bottom of the slide, it's called a feature called manual QoS. And so, for example, here we have 2 volumes, volume C and volume D. Volume C is much smaller in size, but has much higher throughput. And this could be, for example, you have data that this is your data volume, right? And maybe volume D is your log or archive volume, and you don't need it to be so high performant. So you can do this as well, right? So just in this slide, you've seen 3 different ways how ANF is really, really dynamic, and all of this can be done with no downtime and no interruption to your read-write operations. Literally everything just continues. Next slide, please. Now, on the second part is about data protection, right? There's a built-in mechanism to do backups. It's called snapshots. And the way we do it is very storage efficient. Just ignore the diagram for a second, but essentially what happens is that if you have blocks of data in the disk, those are described in a table called a file pointers table, right? So we only take those file pointers, not the blocks of data itself, but just the pointers pointing to those blocks of data. And that's what we take the backup of. And it will then, it's basically telling you where in memory those pieces of data are. And so because we're just dealing with the pointers, it's very fast to do, right? So for example, a 100 terabyte volume, for example, when you take a snapshot, the snapshot file itself would only be in the megabytes, very small, and it can be done in a few seconds, right? And you'll see some cases later on where this capability to actually do backups very fast and very short storage efficient manner manifest in some of the workloads. So you get up to 255 snapshots per volume. So say, for example, you schedule 5 backups per day, then this essentially gives you 51 days looking back, right, where you can actually recover either a file or an entire volume. You can also use this to quickly create, UAT or dev or UAT environments based on a copy of production, right? And all of this is done very fast, and it has no impact to the volume performance itself. Next, please. And then the third enterprise data management feature that's built in is the ability to do disaster recovery through what we call cross-region replication. And as the name implies, it's basically copying your data across 2 different Azure regions, right? What's so special about that? The special thing about this is that because we're working so close with Microsoft on this, we actually use Azure's own backbone, the connection between two different regions, for example, Singapore and Hong Kong. We actually use that backbone, not over the internet, not over your network, but use the actual Azure backbone network to synchronize this data. And so because of that, it's only available in supported region pairs, right? You cannot just choose any pair of regions because we have to set it up beforehand. So on the table on the right, you can see the supported region pairs. For example, Southeast Asia is paired with East Asia and Hong Kong, but also with Australia East. The other thing that you can note is that you can actually do two different ANF service levels. So for example, on your primary side, it might be running on ANF Premium, but to save costs on the DR side, you can run it on ANF Standard. The blocks, small blocks, colored blocks at the bottom show you what happens when you synchronize the data, right? So the first time you synchronize it, you are transferring the entire amount of data. That's unavoidable. But then the second time, the third time, and fourth time you synchronize it, you're basically just sending over the differential changes, right? So it's a very cost-effective manner to do backup, and it's done through the Azure backbone, and it's taken care of at the storage level. So your application doesn't have to worry about it. This is an ANF to ANF synchronization, basically. Next slide, please. All right, so we talked about the features of ANF, right? So high performance, 4.9 availability, support for multiple protocols, and then the three main enterprise data management features. It's a dynamic storage. You can do backups through snapshots, and there's a built-in DR mechanism called cross-region replication. So let me pull this into the real world now and actually show you some real use cases on how ANF can be used, right? So in a nutshell, it's what it says on the right top right corner. Anything that needs high IOPS and low latency storage, that's the key use case for ANF. But to call out some workloads specifically, you can use it for file servers. You can use it for high performance computing, including EDA, for example, or oil and gas, or even AI and machine learning scenarios. You can use it for large scale VDI, including AVD or even Citrix VDI. You can use it to extend storage for your Azure VMware solution. If you're migrating databases as well, if you have a database that needs high performance, you can use ANF as the storage. You can use ANF also for the external persistent volumes for Kubernetes, be it Azure Kubernetes Services or Azure Red Hat OpenShift. And last but not least, SAP. In fact, SAP themselves run some of their storage on ANF. Right, so let's deep dive with real examples to each one of these, right? So next slide, please. Okay, file servers, right? So file servers is an umbrella of basically any application that just needs an NFS or an SMB volume, right? So in this case, we helped a local university in APAC, and their problem was basically they had an online learning platform, right? And they started this before COVID, but particularly during COVID, the intensity and the amount of performance they required just skyrocketed. And so they were having problems with the online learning platform because this was being accessed by 34,000 students, 6,000 different courses, 1,000 lecturers, accessing it as well. So we looked into it in a bit more detail, and it turns out the problem was at the storage level, right? So very easily, essentially, we quickly tested and piloted ANF with them, and then they migrated the data by themselves. I mean, it's quite simple. The whole thing from the first conversation to the end was only 3 weeks. And now they're happily running on that. And because since COVID, they basically chose to do hybrid learning permanently, right? So they have offline classes with online classes. And so this system is still in use, happily supporting their online learning platform, and it's giving them the performance they need. So if you compare the before and after on the right table, right? So the before laggy user experience, especially during peak periods like exams. After, very smooth user experience. It meets all the IOPS requirements even during the peak periods. Previously, they had storage in multiple locations. They were managing their own VM-based storage. They had some elsewhere, etc. Now everything is centralized in ANF and managed easily. Previously, if they had to modify the storage, they needed downtime. Now, no downtime required. And this allowed them to actually support this entire system with a very small team, right? So before, the team was really struggling because it was hard to manage. But now, even with their small team, on the storage part, they're covered. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an example for high performance computing, specifically in the oil and gas industry. Yeah. So the problem that this customer had was that if you're an oil and gas company, you need to run a lot of different simulations when you're analyzing where should I drill, right? And will I find oil there? Analyze the properties of the rock formations in a certain area, for example. So all of this is very data intensive and compute intensive applications, right? And so in their previous scenario, they were only able to run, an engineer could probably only run one simulation run per day. But we moved them into ANF, and this gave them the benefit of actually able to run hundreds of simulation runs per day. This is also coupled with, Azure VMs as well as Azure HPC Cache and Azure Cycle Cloud. So it works really well with all of the HPC offerings from Azure directly, right? And then ANF was the storage. So from one simulation run per day, now you get hundreds of simulation runs per day possible. Previously, a particular report took about a month to generate. And with ANF, it now takes just hours. And this is actually just to share an anecdote shared by the customer. When the simulation finished and the report was generated, they thought it was an error. They thought, oh, it cannot be that fast. Something must have happened. But actually, it didn't. It actually finished. Right. So something that took from 1 month was brought down to a matter of hours. And last but not least, they have a global team around the world, right? Previously, with our previous system, which is on-prem, they weren't able to share data easily across. Now, because it's all in the cloud, all on Azure, everybody can collaborate together, regardless of where they are. So a really big boost in performance, a really big boost in productivity, and in their own words, they call it faster time to oil, right? Next slide, please. And this is another flavor of high performance computing, right? You often find cases where, when you talk about high performance computing, you often also think about analytics, AI, machine learning, etc. This is an example of a retailer in this region who wanted to use AI to do predictive pricing, right? So obviously, they buy their inventory in bulk and they want to sell it, but, can they predict what price they would buy and sell 3 months ahead, 4 months ahead, right? So they obviously have all the historical data and they have the consumer buying patterns, but putting that into an AI model and trying to figure out predictive pricing is hard, right? It's hard on the process side, but it's also hard on the requirements in terms of the components that you need. So they decided to go into Azure and use RStudio on Azure, the RStudio modeling language. And they evaluated a few storage options, right? What would be the storage option that meets 2 criteria: high performance and easy to manage, right? So they essentially eventually settled on Azure NetApp Files that it met both their criteria of high performance as well as very easy to manage. So in the previous situation, there's no previous situation. There was as well. It was a born in the cloud deployment. But the benefits from ANF is that it outperformed other storage options evaluated. They are able to set up and consume it in minutes, and it provides all the security that they need. So this was a case of an AI HPC scenario in the cloud. Next, please. And then the third scenario we want to discuss is virtual desktops, right? Be it Azure Virtual Desktop or other ones like Citrix VDI that you can also deploy in Azure. This one, for example, is a case of a service provider in this area where they had 10,000 users to accommodate. Now they started with 5,000 users, and they tried to do to use a scaled-out file servers, right? Performance was an issue to them for whatever reason, and also the fact that they had to manage everything as a infra as a service was also a taxing part to their team. So we introduced them to Azure NetApp Files and said, look, you can actually run this environment as well on Azure NetApp Files. And they shifted over to it. And now they're getting the benefits shown in the right-hand side, right? So before they had performance problem, even at 5,000 users. Now they're smoothly running 10,000 users. Before they had what's called login storms. So if you're running a virtual desktop environment and everybody's coming into the office at the same time, you run into login storms. Everybody's trying to log in, nobody can log in, right? And in some cases, the bottleneck is the storage, right? So in this case, the bottleneck was the storage. So with ANF, we basically removed that problem of login storms. So when everybody comes to the office in the morning and log in, people can get in, nobody's stuck. And because ANF is a platform as a service offering, it's easier to manage than their previous approach. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned databases before, right? So we can help you migrate databases into the cloud, especially the high performance ones, including Oracle, SQL, MySQL, even Tibero, etc. I should preface this, right? So when you're migrating databases to the cloud, your first option should always be the managed version, right? If there's a managed SQL, you should look into that, right? It's much easier to use. If there's a managed Oracle version, you should look into that. But there are limitations to those managed versions, right? Maybe you need a specific way of deploying it, or maybe your environment needs a specific performance that cannot be met, or maybe you have challenges with the maximum individual file size, for example, right? That's where we can come in, right? We can help you alleviate those problems around performance, or maybe like the maximum file size, etc. So this is a case of a gas company in Europe, in this case, where they moved 55 Oracle databases into Azure, right? And they basically wanted to make sure that, when they're moving this, it's a large footprint. So how can they move it into the cloud and make it easy to manage, but at the same time, manage the cost, right? They had two options, right? They had an option of putting it into Azure and then you're running it on disk. And Ultra Disk might have been capable of running the performance they required, but the costs start adding up, right? The large VMs, high Ultra Disk, etc. So we work with them, the team in Europe worked with them and basically said, look, what if you make the storage really high performant and therefore you can actually downscale your VM capabilities and use cheaper VMs essentially and still get the same level of performance. And so we brought in ANF and now the storage part is increasing performance and the VM part can be actually toned down a bit. This means cost savings, right? So first of all, they only need to provision what they need. Secondly, they managed to go from high-end VMs to lower-end VMs and still get the same performance they require. And here's the third item in the table there, the backup time, right? Previously, it took them 15 hours to do backups, and now they can do the backups in minutes, right? This is another, I mentioned earlier about our capability to do snapshots very, very fast, right? This is an example, right? You save so much time on your backups, and it's easy to manage, obviously. And so they're now running happily 55 Oracle databases in Azure on Azure NetApp Files. Next slide, please. SAP is another example, right? So for example, you're running SAP, you have a few choices right now. You can go the SaaS version, which is SAP Rise, or you can go your own manage your own environment kind of thing. And this really depends on what you actually need, right? So in the case where you want to run your SAP in your own environment that you set up, we can help you, right? So for example, this company here is a beverage company. They migrated their SAP into Azure and they use Azure NetApp Files as the backend storage. And this gave them a lot more, let's say, control over their environment. How do they want to set up, etc. But at the same time, if we look at the benefits, right? When you use Azure NetApp Files as the storage option, it gives you automatically 4 nines availability, right? Which means, for those of you familiar with SAP, which means you can actually not use pacemaker clusters. The reason for pacemaker clusters is actually to give you that HA capability, that extra from 3 nines to 4 nines. But if the storage is already 4 nines out of the box, you don't actually need those pacemaker clusters. So you can actually turn them off, right? So this reduces your VM cost by turning off those pacemaker clusters. Secondly, again, backup. Previously, their backup took 7.5 hours. And with ANF, it took 30 minutes. That's a huge improvement, right? So they were very happy about that. And last but not least, obviously, it's easier to manage than the previous solution that they were looking at. The intent, like I mentioned, is this. SAP is, you need to figure out where you want to go, right? And there's a SaaS option with SAP RISE, which, by the way, uses ANF in the backend as well. Or you want to go your own way and manage your environment. And if you're in the latter bucket, or if you're in a case where, you know what, for whatever reason, you cannot go the SaaS option for SAP, then we can help you. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a rather new one, so I don't have an example to quote at the moment. This literally just came out a few months ago. But this is Azure VMware solution running with ANF data stores. Okay, a bit of background, right? So if you're trying to move your VMware workloads from on-premise to Azure, a no-brainer solution for that is Azure VMware Solutions, right? With that, you get essentially hyperconverged infrastructure, compute combined with memory and storage. And in a minimum configuration, you get three of those nodes: compute storage, and compute storage. And underneath that, you have a vSAN, which is essentially the combination of the storage of the three that you can use for storage. Now, what if you're in a situation where, you know what, that's not enough for my needs. I need more storage, but not necessarily more compute, right? What do you do? Well, the first option is you buy more AVS nodes. Can you click the next button, please? Yep. So the first option is you buy more AVS nodes, and there's merit in this, right? You buy as many nodes as you need until you get the amount of storage that you require, and at the same time you get more compute, right? This is option number one, but it also comes at a cost, because when you're buying an AVS node, you get both the compute and the storage. So now, if you really just need storage, is there a potentially more cost-effective way of getting this without buying the compute? And the answer is yes. Press next, please. The answer is you can extend the storage out to ANF, right? So for example, you stay with a minimum configuration of 3, or maybe you add a few nodes as you need in terms of the compute. And once your compute requirements are satisfied, then you can extend the storage out to ANF. And this can be as large as you want, basically. So essentially, it can potentially be a more cost-effective way of extending your storage, right? If you don't need more compute. And this is available across all ANF tiers, whether you want it to be ANF standard or premium or ultra, depending on the performance requirement that you need. Next, please. And last but not least, this is also rather new. So external storage or external persistent volumes for Kubernetes. So when you're creating a Kubernetes cluster or a pod cluster of Kubernetes, typically there's two ways of doing it, right? You would actually run your Kubernetes completely stateless, right? So they do a job in the integration, that's it. But in some cases, you actually need to save whatever has been done into a persistent storage, right? And so if you want to keep your Kubernetes stateless, you can save that state outside as a persistent volume outside of the Kubernetes cluster. And Azure NetApp Files is one option. In this case, you can see a sample architecture for a deployment of an e-commerce server, Magento, for example, right? So the Magento is running happily in the Kubernetes cluster, and then for the transactions, the various things that they need to keep persistent, they pointed out to Azure NetApp Files. And there's a few links there that you can follow to read a bit more. This also applies to Azure Red Hat OpenShift, by the way. So workloads like IBM Maximo can also benefit from this type of deployment with Azure NetApp Files. Next, please. All right, so I told you a bit about what Azure NetApp Files is. We went through a few key use cases with the benefits that the customers have enjoyed. Let me now go into a demo. Next slide, please. Let me just refresh your memory before we go into the demo, right? So just wanted to point you to the 3 lower levels, right? The Azure NetApp account, the capacity pool, and the volume. And the intent of the demo is, we really want you to just, after this webinar, hopefully you can just go and try it out. I want to show you just how simple it is to set up the Azure NetApp account, the capacity pool, and the volume and then start using it, right? And so within a few minutes, or if you're still reading through the documentation, maybe half an hour or an hour, you can already have your volume set up and you can already test it out, right? So let's look at, next slide, please. So I'm gonna show you 2 demos, right? The first demo is just how easy it is to set it up, right? There's 3 steps, create a NetApp account, create the capacity pool, and then, break up the capacity pool into 1 or more volumes, right? The NetApp account, you only need to create once for a region, right? And that's just a grouping mechanism to group all your capacity pools for that region. So you set that up once, then you can create multiple capacity pools underneath it, and under each capacity pool, you can create multiple volumes. The second demo that I'll show later on is the dynamic storage capability. I told you before, right? It's so easy to change the size and performance on the fly. Well, I'd like to show you that. So hopefully with these 2 demos, you'll really understand the performance levels of ANF, but also the how easy it is to set it up. Let's play the video. All right, so in this video, we're going to do 3 things, right? This is a bit of instruction on the documentation, but first of all, you have to go to Azure portal, and under storage, you'll find Azure NetApp Files. And then the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to create a Azure NetApp account. Yeah, just to group all of our capacity pools together. So you choose the region that you want to deploy it in. Click create. And after waiting a while, the deployment in progress, your Azure NetApp account will be ready to use. Right, now the account is ready. What do we do next? We go to the next level, right? We create the capacity pools. So click on capacity pools, add a pool, and here's where you choose a name, but also you choose a service level, be it ultra, premium, or standard, right? This is where you choose that. And then you can set up your size. The default QoS would be auto QoS, which will tie the size of the volume to the performance. You can choose that to manual if you want to override that. Let's just use auto for now. Okay, so now your capacity pool is being created, right? So you've done the first step to create the NetApp account. You're now creating the capacity pool. And once that's ready, you're ready to divvy that up into volumes, and then the volumes are ready to use. So let's do that. So here's where you actually then need to say, is this going to be an SMB volume, an NFS volume, or a dual protocol volume where you can actually do both SMB and NFS simultaneously? There's a few settings to choose. And then once everything is chosen, you basically click to provision it. You can see there's an option for dual protocol. As I mentioned before, dual protocol means you do both NFS and SMB simultaneously on the same volume. Okay, the volume is not being created, right? So we've done those 3 steps of setting it up. Create an Azure NetApp file account, Azure NetApp account, create a capacity pool, and create our volume. This video was not sped up, right? So literally, it's can be that fast for you to actually set up, your capacity pool and volumes, and you're ready to go. And now, if you want to mount them, you just cut and paste these instructions into the Azure CLI, right? So that's my first demo. The second demo I want to show is how easy it is to change the size of the volume and therefore change its performance, right? So we're starting off, please press play, thank you. we're starting off with a standard volume that's is 2 terabytes in size. So you get 2 times 16 as the performance level, and you get that's basically about 32 megabits per second throughput. Now, what if we want to change it? I need a bit bigger size. So okay, let's just click on the 3 dots and click resize. And let's make it to 4 terabytes from 2 terabytes, right? The expectation is that the performance will also go and become 4 times 16 or 64 megabits per second throughput. And there you go. As you can see, as soon as you finish that, it's upgraded to 4 terabyte size, and the volume is also volume performance is also increased to 64 megabits per second. And just for those of you who are like, well, that's just on the Azure portal, Ricky, is it really that fast now? Let's run this test, all right? It's called an FIO test or a file IO test, right? And as you can see, as it's running, when it settles down, it's going to reach that 64 megabits per second throughput. So this can be done, like I said before, on the fly with no downtime, right? So you can actually manipulate both the size and the performance of your volumes on the fly with no downtime. And this really gives you the ability to completely decouple your thinking. You can just let your business application run. When you have to modify your start, you modify it, right? And it happens completely decoupled in a sense. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. So as I mentioned before, ANF is a first-party service. It's natively integrated into Azure, including all of the different tools. For example, Azure Calculator, right? You can find us in the Azure Calculator. Just go into the Azure Calculator, search for NetApp. It's going to appear like in the bottom of the screen there. Then you can do your pricings across various configurations and whatnot. Next slide. So I want to finish off with this slide, right? Azure NetApp Files is an enterprise NAS available in Azure. It's first party, it's very easy to use, and the key benefits are very high performance, very low latency, 4 nines out of the box, right? Plus, it comes with a bunch of enterprise data management features like dynamic storage, built-in data protection, and built-in disaster recovery through cross-region replication. There's a bunch of different use cases you can see on the screen. I won't go through them, but essentially, these are all real customers. And the table on the right-hand side is specifically APAC customers. Thank you very much. I'll give time back to Francois and Murthy.
Real world, use cases with all those the performance metrics before and after ANF are quite really impressive. And especially when you share, right, that the one simulation which got introduced, increased into 100 simulations, and 7.5 hours of backup time got reduced into within 30 minutes for the SAP workloads. See, these kind of real-time performance metrics are quite impressive. Yeah, I think probably let's look into our Q&A if there are any questions.
Yeah. And maybe a question for myself here, as Francois is we had a lot of performance discussions. I know it's heavily used for scenarios like SAP. Would you like to share any real-time experience you got recently on those use cases, right? That's one of the scenarios where our customers are looking for high performance because they have heavy workload, and when they migrate to the cloud, they're always concerned of how will be the performance compared to their on-prem.
So are you talking about like an example from APAC specifically?
I don't have any specific example right now, but yes, I think that's a pattern we see regularly.
Okay. Yeah, so that's absolutely right. When the customer wants to migrate SAP from on-prem to the cloud to enter Azure, they are specifically concerned about the performance, right? And so one customer that we helped in this region is let me give you an example of a really big one, right? So this is over 100 terabytes. It's a retailer in APAC, and they went through a lot of piloting and POCs with us just to make sure that we can actually meet the claims that we made about the performance, right? And once they found out that we can, they shifted their entire SAP environment in I'll manage it myself, so not a SaaS approach. So using Azure NetApp Files as the storage, and they're running happily, supporting their nationwide retailers, but they're running happily across all of this, managing all their inventories, etc. Apologies, Francois, does that answer your question?
Yes, sure. I mean, it's great to know that we have such an options to manage like every workload, as you mentioned. And typically that's scenarios where also storage keep growing, right? And then the customers are challenging us and says, hey, how is it sustainable and how I need to configure my storage? And I think you, together with the performance, as you mentioned, the flexibility that the NetApp Azure File is bringing, that's really what customers are looking for. One example maybe I have in mind is also AVS. You mentioned it. Similar scenarios where people are used to a certain performance based on their experience on VMware on-prem, and then they are looking for an experience which is native on cloud, still leveraging on the VMware solutions, right? So I think that the combo with Azure NetApp File is really something where the performance and the throughput you can provide is really something that customers are looking at. I don't know whether either Morty or Ricky, you have any experience around VMware and NetApp Files together?
Yeah, so that our ability to provide an external storage for AVS is relatively new. So we're currently in piloting and POCing with a few customers. So I don't have any specific examples to quote out, but I would advise anybody who wants to do this, we work closely with the AVS GBBs, with the AVS Global Black Belt in Microsoft, right? There are specific things that you need to consider that they are better to advise, whether, maybe it makes more sense to actually buy more AVS nodes. And if so, do that, right? But maybe it's like, your performance is really, your requirement is really about storage, more storage, but not more compute. Then we can talk about using ANF to extend the storage. So work closely with Microsoft. We work closely with your AVS team, and together we can approach the customers correctly.
Yeah, Ricky, there is also a question of how these performance metrics were evaluated. Was it against the on-premise performance?
So not always, yeah. So there's two parts. In some cases, the customer was moving from on-prem to the cloud to Azure, right? And then the before and after was comparison between on-prem to Azure. In other cases, for example, the ABD case, they were already in Azure and they wanted to find, let's say, tune their performance better, right? So it was a case of, already in Azure, but using a different configuration, maybe using Azure Disk or Azure Files. And then they saw the benefit of moving to Azure NetApp Files in terms of performance.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And Ricky, also there's another question, and Azure, Snap, is this the only tool to take a snapshot for SAP HANA, or do you have any other tools?
Yeah, very good point. That's a very good question. So we actually recommend using the tools that are available in Azure. We're natively integrated into Azure, right? So with AZAC Snap, or the application consistent Azure Snap tool, Azure Snapshot tool, it gives you the benefit of making it exactly that, application consistent. And ANF snapshot can be done using that tool, the AZAC Snap tool. And with that, essentially your application is put into a state where frozen for a second, if I for lack of a better term. You can take a snapshot and make sure that it's really consistent with application consistent, and then move on. So, is it the only tool? No, you can actually do an ANF snapshot directly against an SAP storage, but we would actually recommend, use the tools that are available, right? So with AZAC Snap, it'll actually allow you to do application consistent, including databases, SAP, etc.
Yep, fantastic. So I think that comes to an end, right? Yep.
I think we have answered the question from the audience. Thank you very much, Morty and Ricky, for joining us today and presenting such an awesome solutions. I'm looking forward for the next session, which will be aired next week. In the meantime, we love to hear your feedback. So please let us know what we can do better to serve you and improve your solutions on the Azure cloud. Otherwise, you will find this content on our YouTube channels very soon. Thank you very much, everyone.